This is the Regenerative Real Estate Podcast. Revitalizing the world together. Hi, everybody. Welcome back. This is Neil Collins. I am the host of the Regenerative Real Estate Podcast. This is an amazing episode that we have for you today. Our guest is Amanda Sturgeon. She's an award-winning architect, a published author, a TED speaker, and I originally knew her as the CEO of the International Living Future Institute. You may know this organization because they started with the Living Building Challenge, and under her leadership, and really over the last decade, they've come onto the scene as global thought leaders in the regenerative real estate space. Be sure to check them out. I wanted to have Amanda come on because she is an expert in biophilic designs and buildings. And that is a term that is starting to come onto the scene more and more. If you don't know what it is, that's okay. Tune in. This is a great episode to get exposed to it. She also has a phenomenal TED Talk that I encourage you to go find. You can find it in our new Facebook group. We created a group for people that they're searching to get connected with like-minded individuals and professionals that they're starting to think, okay, hey, I want to incorporate sustainability into my work or in my life, and I want to find other like-minded individuals with similar values. So go on Facebook, connect with us, contribute. Let's build this movement together. And before we get into the show, I have a big ask for you. If you're really liking the content that we're putting out there, please go to Google Podcast, iTunes, SoundCloud, Stitcher, wherever you're listening to this podcast, and leave us a rating and review. It really does mean a lot because we're putting a lot into this. We're going out and seeking the thought leaders, trying to deliver valuable content because we find that this is such an important conversation to be having right now. So without further ado, let's get into it. I know that you're going to love this episode, and here's Amanda Sturgeon. Welcome back, everybody. I am very pleased to announce our new guest, Amanda Sturgeon. She's joining us today from Seattle, which is great that she's still stateside. Amanda, I found her through the International Living Future Institute, and I'm very excited because I know that she's no longer with them, but she's been a pioneer for biophilic design, and I'd love to introduce her to our listening community. So Amanda, thanks so much for coming on.
Yeah, you're welcome. Happy to be here.
Thanks. Amanda, I know that you're not from the States. Where did you originally grow up?
Yeah, I grew up in the UK, and then I moved to Australia and did my undergraduate in architecture at University of Sydney and stayed there, worked a little bit, and then decided to come to the States to do my master's. And here I still am 24 years later. So yeah, I've now been in the States a while, and I'm actually looking forward to returning back to Australia here in a couple of months' time, and engaging back there with consulting work and bringing kind of regenerative thinking and practices. I mean, actually, much of that thinking is already in Australia, but joining a really great community there and helping to further that thinking.
Whenever you're growing up, did you come from a family of architects?
No, I didn't. My dad actually was a aeronautical engineer. So I guess there is some sort of making background. But no, I actually really didn't know what an architect was until I went to Australia and I traveled through Southeast Asia and Central America before I even went to architecture school. And I was really, in traveling that much, it was a couple of years, I just fell in love with how architecture can really tell a story of a community and of a place and of a history and a culture. And it's really kind of like this representation of what the culture was thinking at that time, its spiritual beliefs, or its will and its relationship with the broader world. And that kind of really struck me, that buildings can really be this sort of cornerstone of like who we are as a society. So I became really fascinated in architecture traveling, and I didn't think I would be able to, do the sort of long study and licensing and all of that. So I actually started just in a design program, and then realized quickly I couldn't really put off my passion for architecture. So I ended up transferring over to architecture. But it was a little later than most people. You know, I was in my early 20s before I started my architecture degree. And but I knew once I started that was kind of my passion. I really have a passion for, this expression that buildings are capable of representing who we are in the world.
I'm going to go out on a limb and say architecture school at that time, this was not mainstream thought. Am
No,
I wrong?
absolutely. I was a bit of an outsider. The nice thing about choosing University of Sydney, however, was that they made everyone do a year-long part of their degree and in sort of an environmental studies around architecture. So it was, we had to make models and put them in wind tunnels and put them in the heliodon and see where the shadows went. And it was very much sort of based on the building in its environment and in its place. So I do think that, University of Sydney at that time was very rooted kind of in, thinking about design for that particular place. And, it was the rise of some really significant architects. I think, people like Glenn Murcutt and Rick LaPlastria were working at that time. Glenn Murcutt's better known internationally, but we're really sort of creating, if you like, a new Australian architecture that was coming out of place and was respondent to their unique climate, because up to that time, it had often been, being a colony, if you like, it had often been that, the architecture just mimicked the UK and Europe versus having its own language that related to their particular climate, which is so different, obviously, to Europe and the UK. So I do think I came into architecture school at a time where that thinking was emerging in Australia, and it really resonated with me as a movement and as a way of thinking about architecture differently. When I came to the US to do my master's, I realized that thinking wasn't as prevalent, and it was very much on the outside, which is one of the reasons why I moved to Seattle afterwards, actually, because there were architects like Miller Hull and Jim Cutler, who were sort of trying to do similar things, creating this regionalism, this architecture of the Pacific Northwest that expressed this place. And that also appealed to me. I didn't end up working with either of those architects, but, I ended up working for Methuen and working on projects that were also trying to, like Islandwood was the project I worked with Methuen on right away. And that was also trying to, express what the Pacific Northwest is, an architecture that's responsive to the climate, place, materials palette, and culture. So I think that has been a theme throughout, starting in Australia all the way through to coming to the Pacific Northwest. I was very much drawn to a community of people who were interested in thinking about place very deeply, and thinking about how that manifests in architecture and in buildings.
So what does that look like when you say they're thinking about place? I've seen in my mind a lot of buildings that are very design forward, but I don't think that many people are exposed to that line of thinking of bringing in the history of the place into a building.
Yeah, I think it's true. I mean, placemaking, the term place can be used in so many different contexts. Sometimes it's about just creating a good, place for a community that's, got some vibrancy and activity to it. And that term's been used for sort of placemaking, in urban design context. I think it's often not used well in building design. But for me, it's really about, before you start the concept for the building, it's about understanding the history of that place, deeply understanding the climate, the ecology, the community and history of people that have inhabited it beforehand. All the things you can learn before the building, starts to be even thought about, let alone formed and built. And, each place in the world has its own uniqueness, its own ecosystem, its own microclimate, its own history of people that inhabited it and related to it, back before even colonialism, especially in the Pacific Northwest and other parts of the world. And, I think what tends to happen in building design is that we come in and we see it as a blank piece of land. And, so the place study, if you like, consists of, there's the road, there's the access point, that's what I have to do with my drainage, and it doesn't take the team or the owner, the whole team don't take the time to really understand the uniqueness of that specific place in the world and how the architecture could represent that and celebrate it. I think, it's not often thought about, and from what I've kind of learned of not having, been an undergraduate in a US architecture school, that it's not really often taught either in architecture education, in the way it really was in my education at the University of Sydney. So I think we used to, obviously build that way, before it became such a global economy. We used to get materials, obviously, from our region. We used to have to rely on natural ventilation and heating and not electricity. So, I often, have said that the, widespread use of electricity allowed us to basically build anything anywhere. And, the global materials economy allowed us to build it out of anything that came from anywhere. And we've really developed our, building design and architecture now on that basis, that we can, have an all glass building in Alaska or Florida. And, you can have them built out of the same materials, even though those materials could have come from, Asia somewhere. So obviously our buildings now are really about often a style, and connecting a sort of style or imagery that, is supposed to represent, the power of a corporation, or, what a hospital should now look like, versus really thinking about an architecture that could be derived from the uniqueness and quality of the particular place it's built in.
Hearing you talk, it makes me think that we glorify steel and the ingenuity in building these skyscrapers and cities and Thomas Edison and electrifying places. And over time, I think we're now very much seeing the effects of isolation and sick building syndrome and pollution, and just a disorientation in our built environment from what we're primordially built for. When did you first start incorporating biophilic design into your vocabulary?
Well, it was really right from the beginning. I think I came out of the University of Sydney. I worked for an architect called Peter Stutchbury, who had worked with, some of the architects I mentioned before, and was really focused on this kind of placemaking architecture that's derived from the place. So I came to the US with that kind of context, and then was fortunate enough after graduate school to work with Methuen and be able to articulate that thinking again with Island Wood, which was one of the first kind of lead projects way back. So I think it's always been there for me in every project that I've worked on as an architect. That's been a focus. It's from Methuen, I went on later to, I spent some time at the city of Seattle because I really wanted to see how I could influence, from the government side. Seattle at that time was building, all of its new public buildings essentially new, the City Hall and Justice Center and, Opera House and library. And there was a lead mandate that was just put in place. It was an opportunity to work at that level of government to see if we could make this happen more broadly. But then later, and I went and joined Perkins & Will. The projects I worked on there too were really sort of bringing that philosophy and trying to bring that to life through higher education projects generally. So I think it's always been there throughout my architecture career. In the last decade at the Institute, that's really probably what drew me to the Institute actually, was that the Living Building Challenge had these principles of living, thinking, creating and designing in relationship to, all that is alive in the world, if you like, and all ecosystems. So I was really drawn to the Institute because, the program and the thinking was really close to my heart already, and it was really the way that I'd been thinking and designing for the, prior 15 years. So, I think it's been one long journey of sort of trying to both practice on projects that have that way of thinking, and what I then realized later is called biophilic design. It had always been a sort of context that didn't quite have a name on it. Sustainable design was the label given to anyone that sort of thought about things sort of from that angle, but it's not really about sustaining. The way of thinking that I started with wasn't about just keeping things as they are. It was always about regenerating life and regenerating communities and, creating more out of a place by having a building there than was there before. And, I didn't really know the term, regenerative either until sort of around that time. So, both the terms living, regenerative, biophilic were very much, sort of topics that were like, oh, that's a name for the way I've been thinking for, the last 20 years. So, I don't really know what came first, whether it's sort of like, I love biophilic design. I think it's really more that's the way I had been thinking for a long time. And it was great to be able to see, the rise of a biophilic design movement with some great people like, Judy Heerwagen and Stephen Callett and Bill Browning, kind of bringing that name into, people's vocabulary. So, as soon as I sort of knew about the phrase of biophilic design, it resonated. And I knew that I sort of wanted to be able to accelerate it and do whatever I could to, make it become a movement, if you like, an awareness for especially the architecture community, but, obviously anyone related to creating buildings.
I've heard you say that it's not so much about the design, but it's about the social ecology of how a building is used. What kind of definition would you, or you maybe not definition, but what kind of parameters would you put on what is biophilic design for people that are not familiar with the term?
Yeah, well, I explain it as really designing as if people and nature were intricately connected. We are nature. We are part of nature. So it's taking a very different, way of thinking from saying there's people over here and there's nature over here, and we'll prioritize nature if it's economically feasible or if we feel like it, which is often the way design happens, where it's like, oh yeah, I'd love to, do that, but what about the money? It's sort of, and that's I think an approach that I got really frustrated with in practice. I felt like the term sustainability and the term sort of relying on a standard or a program to say, yes, I've done it, right, was sort of missing the opportunity that each of those individuals had to actually change the way they think about the world. And, so biophilic design is saying, people and nature are one. There's no separation between us. There's, when we create something, we have the opportunity to think about it as part of an ecosystem. And as you said, a social ecosystem, a natural ecosystem, something that is connecting both people and nature and community. And I think sometimes when people say the word biophilic, they think perhaps about, bio or biomimicry, and they think it's about designing, with lots of plants perhaps, or, saving the trees on the site, or, bringing in some green walls, and they think about sort of plant life. But, I think Stephen Callett really helped to kind of get a deeper thinking about if we are nature, and everything we design, is in reference to that, then what are all the aspects that allow us to have peace and tranquility and, clarity of mind and, that feeling you have if you're in the woods walking, or whatever your spot might be, in the ocean swimming, in nature, that makes you feel kind of grounded and connected. We can bring all of those aspects of how that feels into our buildings. We can think about our buildings as natural systems as we create them, and think about how those influence who we are, how we interact with each other. And, it starts with really simple things like, everyone should have access to natural light and ventilation. We should be able to hear the wind when it's blowing, and, hear the birds when they're singing, and smell the rain when it's falling. And so many of our buildings are hermetically sealed now. I think it's a statistic about half of global office workers have no access to daylight all day. And that's, it's not uncommon. We've got these bat buildings, if you like, big square buildings that are dark in the middle, full of rooms that, have no access to light. So there's so many research studies now that, they've been going back for the last 20 years. There's been a lot of research studies for 20 years that have shown, that that's really bad for human health. There's higher levels of sickness and disease. It takes us longer in hospitals with no access to daylight to recover. We get poorer test scores in schools. We're more productive if we just spend an hour in nature. So, there's a lot of studies that show we're not able to be ourselves. We're not able to be productive, which when people start to make the financial argument, it's like, that's a huge economic loss if people are running at 20-30% less productivity than they could be if they were just had a window. So I think biophilic design offers us the opportunity to not just think about daylight and fresh air, but also think about the patterns in nature, the sensory variation we get through light and shadow outside. How does that play a part inside? Often, again, our inside environments are like beige surfaces that offer no kind of visual stimulation or curiosity or excitement in the way that when you're in nature, something always different is happening, and there's a richness to that information that stimulates our brain. So there's a lot of depth to biophilic design beyond sort of the surface things that people might think of, let's bring in some more plants, or let's make sure people have daylight. Those are two great steps, that's the starting points, but there's a lot more to the information richness and sensory variation, and both stimulating all senses, that could really make our buildings healthier for people, more engaged in their communities. But also, it was interesting, actually, we have a sustainability week at Mott MacDonald where I now work, and we had a debate session yesterday as part of that, and one of my colleagues and I said, I'll debate whether you should think about health first in a building, and he was going to debate carbon, even though we both actually believe we should think about both at the same time. But we just did it for the exercise. And in thinking about my argument for that, I would say that if you create buildings that connect people to the outside through natural daylight and natural ventilation, if you create buildings that are utilizing their local and regional materials and stimulating their regional economies, you will already have a building that uses less energy, less embodied carbon, and less operational carbon, because you're reliant on what that place and nature can already give you in terms of heat and air and ventilation, and local materials that don't need to be transported around the world. So it will already create low carbon buildings, or create the sort of foundation to be able to have zero carbon buildings. But if you start with let's just reduce the amount of energy, well, you could do that by through a mechanical system. Putting everybody in a windowless box could be the right solution in some climates to reduce the amount of energy. But I think that would gradually, destroy the human spirit and sense of community that we have with each other.
One of the things that I've seen the Institute do over the years is really push this direction, not just with the Living Building Challenge, but now there's much more of an urban planning, a rewilding of our urban environments, living communities. What was that like when you were at the helm of the organization for several years? And it really seems like you were able to bring in some of these. Was this a concerted effort, or was it a very fluid movement while you were there?
Yeah, I was at the Institute for 10 years and, was CEO for 4 and executive director a couple of years before that. So it's, I know now looking back, it feels like it went in a snap, but yeah, it was a long time, I guess. And yes, when I joined, there was just the Living Building Challenge. And, I just felt right away that it had the bones of being a really great, obviously it's a great program for where we ideally should head, but it had the bones to be able to, I think, be broken down and be more than just that, so more than just a few buildings a year, being able to achieve it. And I think my goal always at the Institute was, how do we kind of create, programs that can allow different entry points. And so, yeah, one of the first things was splitting off zero energy and being able to have that as a focus. And then broadening into communities and seeing that, often the solutions are better handled, especially around zero water, at a community scale than they are in an individual one building at a time scale. And seeing the opportunities for being able to do those kinds of principles, regenerative principles, at the community scale. I will say, though, the community scale is tough because, particularly in the US, often, existing neighborhoods may not think in terms of community, and, new developments take such a long time, and there's so many phases and different people involved that it's difficult to keep going with, sort of principles or ideas. But yes, then we broached into products and sort of really thought about all the products that make up the buildings. And that was particularly important in terms of health, because I think often there's not a lot of thought put by designers into the downstream impacts of materials, what chlorine has done to, a particular watershed where PVC was made, what it might have done to the health of workers that work in those factories. And often I think in the building industry, we'd focus on health being about the indoor air quality specifically, and not about all those downstream impacts of the materials. So, thinking about products became really important while I was at the Institute. And in the last few years, I was really focused on how do you just scale the Living Building Challenge. So I brought out, wrote the core program, which is kind of a step down, but like the basic 10 things you need to do. And created a volume program for Living Building Challenge so that, large companies could achieve it over their whole portfolios globally. So I was really always looking for opportunities to stretch and scale the program. But yeah, one of the big things for me while I was there was focusing on biophilic design and creating a biophilic design initiative. And I wrote, my book, Creating Biophilic Buildings, because with all of those programs, what I saw missing was people's ability to actually make the change in themselves. So they might pick up the Living Building Challenge or a standard, and they might say, okay, I'm just going to do the building where I already usually do it, with the same team, the same financing structure, the same kind of approach to how I think about the site, and I'm just going to force this certification program in. And what happened was that, the costs go through the roof, to try to do it that way. So I felt like people were often missing the design shift they needed to make, which was really, as we talked about at the beginning, thinking about place-based solutions first. That was just absent. And I think having practiced as an architect and having lots of frustrating conversations with clients, as I mentioned, you were like, will it cost more? If not, I'm not going to do it. When I started to have conversations with people that were about, well, what's your connection to this place? Or just stepping away and talking about their own connection to nature, how they might be able to bring some of that in, thinking about health and wellness of their own community or family. A sort of new thoughts opened up. And I think coming at it from that direction, I found that people were able to kind of start making a shift about their own design thinking. So, as great as it was to sort of see the programs get some adoption and get some great catalyst projects, I felt like the larger work ahead was about changing people's mindsets and behavior into how we value buildings, how we approach the design of them, and how we design out of silos, and move from sustainability to regeneration. And I think we can only do that if we awaken to our own relationship with nature and we accept we are part of nature, and we start to think about the buildings that we create as habitats that are part of an ecosystem. So unless people change their mindsets, it's great to have certification programs that you can just apply, but I think we won't get to solving the global climate crisis that way, is my sense.
That is a beautiful message, and it's a segue into a question that you likely haven't gotten before, but I do want to go there. You're a mom of 2 children, and we had a child, and it was very much a catalytic point in our lives, in our careers. What do you think that did for your work and your philosophy?
Oh yeah, my oldest turned 20 a week or so ago. So it definitely was reflecting on that 20 years. How could that be? But yeah, I mean, I think when you have kids, you definitely, you want to be able to create, a safe and beautiful world for them and their kids, right? So that's definitely, been an influence in my life. I think as much as anything, how my kids have influenced me is that, I want them to be able to grow up in a world where, there's richness and diversity and in nature and in community, and they've always sort of been, yes, a guiding post for me for keeping going when there's been naysayers or there's been people that have differing opinions, and they help me certainly to stay sort of steady on the course. But yeah, I definitely was. I mean, my kids joke that I'm really just a hippie at heart, because I definitely was more on that sort of, trajectory before they came as well. And as I said, even back to, studying, it was always a passion of mine to not just sort of selfishly, if you like, make sure that there's a world for future generations that's mine, but for everybody. And I want to be able to see all ecosystems survive and thrive, whether that be just about my family or everyone else's family.
What can we expect? You're making a big move across the pond, the bigger pond, to Australia. What can we expect with your future work?
Yeah, well, I'm really wanting to sort of take the thinking that I've built so far, both at the Institute and before, and find a place where I could scale it. I mean, as I said, that was really my focus at the Institute, was how do we scale this? How do we go beyond a small tribe of people, passionate tribe of people and community, to, this being mainstream thinking? And we have a long way to go to get there, right? To have regenerative thinking be the mainstream way of designing the things that we make as human beings. But I feel like my, next 10 years of my career, I want to figure out how to scale that. And so I was excited to join Mott MacDonald because they're, a huge global consulting company. And, they work on really large projects. And there's an opportunity, I think, for us together to really start to influence large-scale projects that can then tip the whole market, in a new direction. I'm also really excited to work in the Asia Pacific region because, as much as we're now seeing things in the media about, the UK ran on renewable energy, instead of coal for 2 weeks or whatever, and different parts of the world, New Zealand's now running on 70% renewables, and these stories we hear from, if you like, from the US, Australian or UK focused perspective, or Europe focused perspective. But, in Asia Pacific, it's actually the only region in the world where the, reliance on fossil fuels increased in 2018. And so, it's a part of the world that's actually building coal-fired power plants that is growing rapidly. And I'm really interested in figuring out how that sort of next wave of development that's likely to happen in the Asia Pacific could be done in a way that skips the mistakes that the US and other countries have made in relying on coal power, for example. So yeah, my title is Regenerative Design Lead. I'm, focused in on bridging kind of, biophilic social ecosystem thinking, across projects, large infrastructure projects and buildings. And, I'm also really excited to be connected with an amazing global network at Mott MacDonald. So, doing work all over the world and being able to kind of really create sort of thought leadership around how we might be able to scale regenerative thinking beyond sort of one beautiful project at a time and into, every project, ideally.
That role sounds like it was made for you, actually.
Yes, I'm excited. So far, it's great. I'm learning a lot, and I think it's great to be able to be part of a network of people that are really working day to day in terms of thinking about carbon and sustainable development, and how we might broaden this way of thinking globally.
Amanda, what a fascinating life and career that you've had. I thank you because you are one, as with the other podcast guests, that have helped to awaken me and so many others to what is possible, and not just feel completely dejected and pretty bad about the state of affairs of where we're finding ourselves, and to know that you're working on taking a body of work that's really snowballed into something even bigger and better. And how do we do this at scale? Because that is certainly a critical point in time to be doing that. I look forward to following the career where you go from here. I encourage people to get your book, Creating Biophilic Buildings, watching the content that you've already got out there. You've got a great TED Talk that I hope people will tune into. So thank you so much for your time. This has been an absolute pleasure.
Yeah, well, thanks for asking me, and thanks for helping to accelerate regenerative design thinking. We need that.
Okay, everybody, that is a wrap. Thank you for tuning into this episode. I hope that you got a lot out of it. These conversations are so important to me, and they are so important to the times that we're finding ourselves in. If you want to connect with other like-minded individuals and with thought leaders in this movement, be sure to check out our Facebook group. It's called Regenerative Real Estate. You can find it, request to join. We'd love to have you build the community with us. If you want to find out more about us and our organization Latitude, you can go to chooselatitude.com. We're a Pacific Northwest-based real estate sales and development team that help people live in more thoughtful and resilient ways. We believe in sustainability as a powerful force for good, and that's why we're putting so much emphasis on creating meaningful dialogue and content like this podcast to bring it to you. Just one last ask before we end this podcast. If you could please go to whatever platform you're listening to this podcast on and leave us a rating and review and hit subscribe. That way you can get notified whenever we're dropping the next episode. And the feedback is great for us. It really validates what we're doing, and it really goes to signal to potential guests that, hey, people are tuning into this, they want to hear from you, and they want to hear about the regenerative real estate space. Okay, thanks again for listening. Until next time.